Thank you so much for joining the Little Lunch Lectures today. We are very glad to have you July 17th. My name is Stephanie Barrett. For those of you who have not yet met, I'm the Director of Donor Relations at the Coastal Land Trust. We are recording the lecture today, and it's live on Facebook. So if you don't want to be on the video, just turn your video button off and you won't be shown or recorded. Okay, yep, just like usual, we'll keep everybody on mute. And if somebody comes in and they're not on mute, I'll mute them. And then at the end, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask Lindsay a question. So with that said, I would like to introduce today Lindsay Addison, coastal biologist at the Wilmington office for Audubon, North Carolina. Her role there is to manage, monitor, and protect coastal birds in North Carolina and beyond. She has a wealth of knowledge, experience, and passion for coastal birds and habitat protection. Lindsay, thanks for sharing your time with us today. Can't wait to see your beautiful photos and hear your stories.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. So hopefully this will be kind of fun and diverting at our Friday lunch hour. So I guess without further ado, we'll get started. I'm just gonna kind of do a introduction to nesting waterbirds in eastern North Carolina. So coastal birds. That's what I do most of my work on for Audubon, North Carolina, and we're looking at a great egret right here. And let's see if I can get the slide to advance. Sometimes this is, success. So I'm just gonna give you a little brief introduction to the work that Audubon, North Carolina does in our coast program. And one aspect of our work on the coast is our sanctuary system, which consists of about 19 different sites, primarily in the southern half of the state, from Ocracoke Inlet down to the Cape Fear River. The sanctuary system has been around since the 1980s. Audubon was originally started back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and there was Audubon work in North Carolina. T. Gilbert Pearson was an early Audubon fellow back in the day, but in the modern era, we started our work in the 1980s. We've got myself and two seasonal folks who work for us, many partners around the state, including the Coastal Land Trust, and over 40,000 nesting birds and all of their offspring every year. So that, in a nutshell, is our sanctuary system. And altogether on those islands, those 40,000 birds represent anywhere from about a third to just over 40% of the nesting coastal waterbirds in North Carolina. So the sites that we manage and protect represent a significant proportion of our state population and our regional population. So the health of these sites and the protection of these sites is important not only for the welfare of those individual birds, but also for their populations as a whole. And I want to make sure just to cover a little bit about what specifically our work looks like, because sometimes people ask me, what do you do all day? I spend a lot of time in the field. I spend a lot of time interacting with people, and the three main components of our work is management. So management is basically anything that you would do in order to make a site suitable or better for your target species. In our case, for our purposes of nesting birds, things like brown pelicans, great egrets, least terns, American oyster catchers. You can see a couple of volunteers here setting up what we call symbolic fencing, which is signage and string in order to maintain a safe nesting area for birds at the south end of Wrightsville Beach. We also do monitoring, and monitoring is really important because you don't know how well your management is working if you don't check in and see how your bird populations are doing. Sometimes that involves counting birds, like this is actually a volunteer and a good friend of mine, Jill Palusas, who owns the Wild Bird and Garden store here in Wilmington and Southport. She came out and helped us count white ibis nests on Battery Island. And So we want to know abundance for the species that we manage. We also, for some of them, want to know productivity, how many young they produce every year. We might also have some specific questions, and that would fall under research where we're trying to find out something in particular. For example, we're recently wrapping up a project that was looking at the shoreline of Battery Island and the vegetative communities on Battery Island, because it's one of our most important nesting sites in the entire southeastern United States for white ibis. So we wanted to look at shoreline change over time and the tree species that the birds that nest on the island were using. So we had some graduate students from UNCW help us out with that, and hopefully we'll have a publication very soon. So our article is in review, so we're excited about that. But that's kind of the basic, the three basic things that we do at our sites that we manage around the state. And the sites that we manage, what kind of sites are they? They're almost all islands, or subsets of islands. And we have islands in estuaries and sounds. So Pamlico Sound, Core Sound, the Cape Fear River. And those islands might be natural islands. This is Shellbed Island. For those of you that are from the Wilmington area, if you're familiar with the Cape Fear River, this is down south of Fort Fisher on the main channel of the Cape Fear River, is what we're kind of looking off towards. And this is what we call a shell rake. It's really a deposit of old oyster shell. And these little elevated spots along the marsh islands fringes are what supports many species of nesting birds, especially American oyster catchers and laughing gulls and willets. And these are just natural formations that occur primarily in marshes. We also have around the state artificially created islands called dredge material islands. This happens to be another island in the Cape Fear River that we call South Pelican Island. It's near the National Gypsum dock, if anybody on the Zoom chat boats. And it is a fantastic spot for royal terns, and that is in fact that white cloud that you see above the island. A bald eagle flew by, and all the royal terns nesting on the island got up. They recognized that the bald eagle was a scary predator, and they hoped to overwhelm and drive it away in the confusion of their colossal flush. And so dredge material islands are also very important for nesting birds around the state. And finally, we have barrier island beaches. Also really important habitat for nesting birds. Some of the species found on the other types of islands are also found on barrier island beaches, and some are a little more specialized. They're only found in one place or another, but they primarily overlap. This is a view of Lee Hutaff Island. It's an island that Audubon, North Carolina manages. We have partnered in the past with Coastal Land Trust to help acquire parcels on it in order to protect it from development. This is looking north up the coast from the south end of the island. And this was taken shortly after Florence. And it's kind of a really great example of why barrier islands are such good habitat and why undeveloped barrier islands are such good habitat. You're looking at creative destruction right here, where there's a lot of overwash happening due to the storm that's just recently had recently gone past. And that cleaned the slate of dunes and vegetation, opened up a lot of great bird habitat. The dunes are building back now. It's all part of a natural cycle. And this is why especially undeveloped barrier islands are so important for birds, because they can move and change and adapt to storms and other conditions. And in doing so, they create and maintain bird habitat in this really dynamic way. So it's never the same island twice. It's a really cool place that we get to work at. So why are the birds on the islands? What is the point of being on an island if you're a bird? First of all, if you're on an island, there tend to be fewer predators, specifically mammalian predators. Now, pretty much any species of mammal can swim, but especially in the case of those natural and dredged material islands, they tend to be on the small side, and they tend not to have a lot of other resources on them to support predators like raccoons, foxes, coyotes. Barrier islands, a little bit less so, but so sometimes we have to do predator management, and also storms like Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Joaquin. Those can help kind of wipe off some of the predators, set the slate clean, and keep them at manageable levels for the nesting birds. Also, the habitat on the islands needs to be elevated above flooding. And this is a picture of it was 1992 or 1993 when the Mississippi River and the Missouri River flooded. I don't know if folks remember that far back. But anyway, I didn't have a picture of an island underwater because that would just look like water. So the habitat that the birds needs to be just enough above high tide that they won't get inundated. But if it's too high, it can become too vegetated and the birds won't like it for that reason. So there's kind of got to be a happy medium. And then finally, you need to have the right kinds of vegetation and the right kind of substrate in order for birds to want to nest. We're looking at an American oyster catcher nest, and they need to have basically some sandy substrate to nest in. Their eggs are placed in a nest that is actually just a simple depression that the birds scrape with their feet and their bellies into the sand. So it's just a little simple bowl-shaped spot that they lay their eggs in. And if you tried to scrape out your nest in mud and then it rained, your egg would get bogged down and it would actually suffocate. Eggs are a semi-permeable membrane, which means that they respirate because the embryo growing inside the egg needs to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, just like we do. And so if your egg is sitting in a mud puddle, that won't work. So you need really good, well-drained sand if you're a ground nesting bird, like a least tern or an oyster catcher. And if you're a tree nesting bird or a shrubbery nesting bird, you might want to have some marsh elder or some other type of vegetation. So you need to have the right substrate for nesting. And that's what makes these islands really suitable for the nesting birds. And there's a lot of islands and a lot of coastal areas in North Carolina and around the entire Atlantic seaboard, but you got to have the right mix of habitat and other conditions for the birds to want to nest there. And so I'm going to just kind of go through about 4 or 5 of our most iconic and easy to see species around around coastal North Carolina, especially southeastern North Carolina, and give you a little introduction to them. The first one I have to always include is the brown pelican. They're one of my favorites, and everyone else seems to like them too. This is a pelican colony also on the Cape Fear River, and you can see that a lot of these birds are sitting. They're sitting on nests. Pelicans like vegetated areas. They'll nest in a variety of different kinds of vegetation. They'll nest in grassy areas, which is what they're doing here. They'll also nest in trees. And if there isn't enough vegetation right in the spot that they want to nest, they'll actually bring in the vegetation for themselves. On Audubon Islands around the entire state, we usually have between 1,200 to 1,500 pairs of pelicans, and that's usually about 24% of the state's nesting brown pelicans. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Our total statewide population of brown pelicans is somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 pairs, depending on the year. Pelicans nest, they actually build their own nests. They bring in vegetation, and sometimes they're pretty high. It's over 12 inches in diameter. And the male does a lot of the stick bringing in, and the female does a lot of the actual nest assembly. And then once the nest is completed, she'll lay 2 to 3 eggs. They're a little 2 to 3 times the size of a chicken egg, so pretty big. And just like a chicken egg, nice and bright white. They get kind of dirty and grimy looking over the course of the about 28 to 35 days that they're going to incubate. And the male and the female during that period of time both incubate the eggs. And then when the chicks are born, they are called altricial. That means they're naked and helpless at birth. So just like songbirds, they're basically little floppy pink things. And the pelican parents are incredibly gentle, actually, despite being these big, awkward birds with goofy bills and big webbed feet. They regurgitate fish into the nest for the babies to eat. When they get older, the chicks will actually intercept the food. They'll stick their heads into the parent's throat as they're regurgitating and get the food that way. So it's kind of a crazy sight to see, if you can imagine a much bigger chick than this and with feathers, rummaging around inside the parent's pouch. And the parents don't carry fish in their pouch. People sometimes ask that question, but I think that the chick feeding maybe made people think that they're getting the fish out of the pouch, because it really does look like the chick has just got its head right down there in the pouch. And those chicks are going to take between 8 to 12 weeks to fledge, which just means to learn to fly. And it depends on if the chicks have got siblings or not, and it depends on how much the parents are able to feed them. And so that's kind of pelican nesting in a nutshell. The next species we'll talk about, another really numerous species on our Audubon Islands, is the white ibis. And of course, Battery Island, some of you may have heard of that, is one of the most important white ibis nesting sites in North Carolina and the Southeast. It's an island that we manage. And it's just opposite the Southport shoreline. So if you go down to the city of Southport in Brunswick County and go to the little park there on the riverside and look out from the park, you will see Battery Island. And on Battery Island at this time of year are thousands of pairs of white ibis, up to 10,000 pairs in the recent past. And when they show up at the beginning of spring, so in April, they're really pretty. They've got bright white feathers, and the bill and their legs have turned bright red, and this is how they attract a mate. So by looking like that, and it actually works. And before too long, they get into the business of building the nest. And again, the male tends to bring in the sticks, the female tends to build the nest, and it's all sweetness and light. They have 2 to 3 eggs. They'll hatch in about 3 weeks. And white ibis chicks, when they're born, are actually not white, they're black. They've got a little black down on them. And you could see that in the upper left-hand corner. That's what an ibis egg looks like. And there's its sibling that has come out of its egg. And for the first couple of weeks, you could see the chicks are really adorable. They're soft and fuzzy, and they kind of look very cuddlesome with the parents. The male and the female are really busy. They like to go and feed in freshwater habitats when they're bringing up the young chicks, because food that's coming out of salt water has got a whole lot of salt in it that the chicks can't really exclude from their system yet. The adults birds have got a gland that actually gets rid of salt, so they can drink salt water, but when they're young, that system isn't online yet. So the adults go inland, and the favorite food for these little guys is actually crawfish or crawdads or crayfish. Take your regional pick for what you want to call that critter. So anyway, after a couple of weeks of having cute chicks, something horrible happens, which is that they turn into teenagers. And again, they're fed by regurgitation, and you can see that the regurgitation is triggered. The parent comes back to the nest, the chicks will grab the bill, and they'll be squawking up a storm. They kind of make a sound like gargling, actually. It's not a cheeping sound like a songbird. So imagine like a really aggressive gargling sound. And then the chicks proceed to basically mug the parent for food. And this time of year, most of the chicks are quite large. They're starting to learn to fly, and they're actually, if you're down at Battery Island, you can actually see the recently fledged chicks chasing the parents on the wing, trying to get them to continue to feed them. So it's really quite a mad dash to get your kids raised, and then to figure out how to escape from your children once they learn to fly. But it's a really cool sight to see. Battery Island's doing very well this year. Lots of new fledglings coming off of it. There's other species of birds there as well, but the white ibis always put on a wonderful show. Kind of turning, those are a couple of species that we find on the natural and on the dredge islands. Turning now to our barrier beaches, one of the most common species that you'll find anywhere on the coast of North Carolina is the least tern. It is the smallest tern in North America. It's the only tern that has a yellow bill. So if you see a little bird, it's not even the size of a robin, with a yellow bill and this slick black cap, that's going to be a least tern. And they are found almost exclusively on barrier beaches and elevated sandy shoals. They're very, they take advantage of recently created habitats. So they don't want to be anywhere near vegetation. They want to be out in the open sand. And that's because they can see predators coming. So they have to worry about falcons and crows and gulls, and their communal defense, they nest in a group called a colony. Their communal defense is to mob the predator. So they'll do that on the wing in the case of a gull or a crow swooping into the colony. But if a ghost crab, which is another predator on these birds, if a ghost crab comes into the colony, you can see them do mobbing behavior on foot as well. So they're kind of equal opportunity harassers for whatever kind of predator is coming down the pike. Obviously, that's a chick and an egg in the upper left-hand corner, and I just can't stress enough how cryptic they are. They blend in so well with the sand. Again, they're like the oyster catcher. They make a simple scrape in the sand, and they're just really blend in. You would, even when you're looking for them, sometimes you hardly notice them until you're right on top of them. And one of the best places to see least terns around southeastern North Carolina is Lehutaf Island. It has, in most years, large least tern colonies. And last year, actually, we did our count up on Lee Island, and we had 1,034 nests of least terns, and that was the largest colony ever recorded in North Carolina. It probably isn't the largest colony ever, because back in the day, back before the turn of last century, before we started developing our coast, colonies of that size would probably have been more typical. But it was really exciting for us to have such a magnificent colony. And we had, again, a large number of least terns on Lehutaf Island this year, is over 800, but scattered in about 3 different colonies. The biggest colony was probably actually down on Hutaf, the south end of that island. And this photograph shows how we count the nests of the least terns. We first of all, we get some help. The person in the foreground is actually one of the state sea turtle biologists, but we train them up on what the eggs and the chicks look like, and we give them a stick, and we basically walk in a row through the colony, and we just drag a line so we can see where our lanes are that we're counting. And so that's how so when we say we had, X and so number of nests, it's probably because we actually went and counted them. And this is Lee Island, but I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. So that wasn't from our giant colony last year, but it was quite a wonderful sight. Another beach nesting bird that you will find, primarily on Wrightsville Beach, on the south end of Wrightsville Beach, is the black skimmer. And this is one of the strangest looking birds that you'll find. And it's also one of the strangest sounding birds. So the appearance of the black skimmer is unusual because its lower mandible is actually longer than its upper mandible. The skimmers are the only birds that have that adaptation, and it's to help them forage. They fly just along the surface of the water, and they drop that lower mandible into the water, and then whatever it hits, probably a small bait fish, but also possibly shrimp or other sea life, their bill snaps shut, and they've got that prey item in their clutches. They also have a very interesting call. It sounds kind of like a dog barking, and John James Audubon referred to them as sea beagles for that reason. And I think it's pretty accurate. If you are able to go down to Wrightsville Beach, the very south end of Wrightsville Beach is where the skimmer colony is. There are about 134 pairs of black skimmers there this year. It's one of the largest colonies in the state on a regular basis. They raise, and they do a really good job of raising their chicks. We usually average at least 0.5 fledglings per pair, which is good for birds in general. And we have had some years where we've produced over 1 fledgling per pair. So that's a really great site to see these birds at. And there are lots of fuzzy chicks running around. One of the other things that we do with the black skimmers, in addition to counting them and trying to monitor their productivity, is we've recently started a banding program where we put a little plastic bracelet on the legs of some of the chicks. in order to find out where they go. Black skimmers are one of the species in the state that is in decline. So they're a species of concern they're definitely a species of concern. And last year was our first full year of banding. We got 101 chicks banded from 2 different sites in North Carolina. Those are the orange dots there on the right-hand side of the screen. There's an island up in Pamlico Sound that we banded at, and then Wrightsville Beach is the southern dot. And then you could see the smaller dots are all the places where the birds have been seen since. And so we're really kind of excited to see what we learn about where our birds are going, when they come back, where they start to nest in the state. So we'll learn more about their dispersal, we'll learn more about their demographics and about their survivorship from hatching to first to breeding. So that's a really interesting project that we got started last year, fortunately, and we're able to do a little bit of banding still this year. So despite the pandemic. And our last species that I'm going to go on about is the American oyster catcher. Another great species. We manage quite a lot of oyster catchers. We have over 100 pairs on the Cape Fear River on islands that Audubon manages, and then we have another 25 pairs up on Lehutaff Island. They're territorial. They don't nest in groups. So unlike these other birds that we've been looking at, they're solitary. This is one of my favorite pairs. They live on an island up in Ocracoke Inlet called Beacon Island. And this is taken in the early springtime, and they're just starting to stake out their territory. Oyster catchers nest on all of the above. So you can find them on Barrier Island beaches. This is an oyster catcher chick that hatched off of Masonboro Island, but they're also found on estuarine islands, whether it's a dredge material island or a natural island, you'll find them there. They take about 25 days to hatch, and then the chicks adorably follow the parents around and are fed shellfish. They eat just what you think they eat: oysters, mussels, any kind of bivalve. The adults can pry those open. And the chicks take about a month to learn to fly, a little more than a month, but their bills aren't well enough developed at that point for them to really be proficient at foraging. So the parents continue to feed them for another month to 3 months. And this is in the scientific literature called extended juvenile dependency. And in human beings, it's called college, but you get the idea. We know a lot about oyster catchers. They're a really charismatic bird, and we know a lot about them because they're another of these species that we've banded. Our oyster catcher banding program in the state of North Carolina has been going on since the early 2000s. It was started by North Carolina State University. Dr. Ted Simons and his students out on Cape Lookout National Seashore and Cape Hatteras National Seashore started banding. And Ted and I now coordinate oyster catcher banding throughout the state at most oyster catcher nesting sites. So each oyster catcher gets a metal band, which you can see on the right hand or the left hand side of your screen there. And that is an engraved metal band with a 8 or 9 digit number that is unique to the bird. But we want the public to be able to see and report bands as well. It's really, really hard to read those metal band numbers. You pretty much have to find the bird dead or recapture it. So for the purposes of professional, our biologists and technicians that are monitoring oyster catchers and the public, we put these field readable bands on the bird. And if you've got a pair of binoculars or a camera with a good zoom lens, you can read these bands. So if you see a skimmer, if you see a black skimmer, or if you see an oyster catcher, and you've got a pair of binoculars or a spotting scope or a camera, take a look at its legs and you might be able to read the band code on it and find out where it was from. And so we know we have a lot of oyster catchers. We know they can live to be over 20 years old thanks to banding. And we know a lot about their movements and demography around the state. So that's just a few of my favorite species on the coast. I'm going to talk really briefly now just about what the birds need from us so they can continue to be successful. And this is, for perspective, Elise Tern incubating his or her nest during a tropical storm. It's sitting there facing into the wind. It's got its eyes shut so the sand doesn't hurt its eyeballs, and it's just going to sit there. And as long as the floodwaters don't come up too high, it's going to be just fine. But what the birds have a really hard time dealing with is when we start screwing things up for them. This is a dredge project that dredged away black skimmer nests as they were just getting started several years ago. There's a series of unfortunate events, but when we start messing up their habitat and disturbing them, they have a really hard time getting by for obvious reasons. And so one of our most important messages for anybody that loves nature and loves the coast is how important it is to manage human disturbance. And everyone has a role to play in that. If you're someone that goes out in nature and you notice, first of all, signs that say area closed or anything else like that, bird nesting, please stay back, listen to the signs. That's the best thing you can do. But not all nesting areas are signed. You might notice that there's a bird flying overhead repetitively, or calling, or running around back and forth constantly. Maybe it's pretending its wing is broken. Those are all the signs of the bird trying to communicate to you that you're too close to its nest or to its chicks, and it would really like you to go away. And so the best thing you can do is just go away. Move back until the bird calms down and resumes more normal bird behavior. But if you've got a bird repetitively circling, calling, running back and forth, walking back and forth, those are all signs that the bird's distressed. And a lot of times people just don't notice that because it's a bird, it's cool, or they're paying attention to something else. They're looking for shells, or they're enjoying the wider view. So just be aware when you're out in nature, these birds nest in all different types of habitats. And we do a lot of work, not this year because of the pandemic, but we do a lot of work to try to educate the public. We show people the birds, we talk to the public. And this is an example. We've got one of our staff members, that's our volunteer coordinator. Some of you may have gotten to meet Marlene Ader, and she will tell you all about the birds, whether you no matter where she is. If she is talking to you, she's probably going to work birds into the conversation. And a few other things bird space, just to make sure. I figured we probably have an audience of people that like to go out in nature. Disturbance in general is harmful to birds. It wastes their energy, even if they're not nesting. Birds travel long distances on their annual migrations. And so even something as benign as, I have a dog, he's an old dog, he used to like to chase birds, but now he's become pretty sedentary. But it's really important not to let dogs chase birds, not to let dogs harass wildlife. You know, if you wouldn't want to harass wildlife, you wouldn't want to let your dog do the same thing. So keeping your dog on a leash and only letting him run when there's an area where there aren't any birds around is a really good practice for birds. Other things that we have to deal with that birds face is just having a lot of presence of people on our coasts. And again, that's why it's so important that we post off areas that are good nesting habitat so that the birds can use it. So we can have places for people to come and enjoy the beach like you see in the upper right-hand corner, which is great. People can enjoy that. But just across the inlet on the other side of that photo is Masonboro Island. And Masonboro Island posts areas for birds to make sure that they're safe from disturbance. And so it's really important to set aside areas for birds as well. Coastal development, engineering, anything that alters the natural coastal processes that maintain barrier islands and shoals and inlets affects the formation of bird habitat. So it's really important to keep bird habitat intact, and it's important to keep the natural processes that sometimes destroy, but also sometimes create bird habitat intact too. So putting up things like terminal groins is bad for bird habitat because it prevents barrier islands from naturally changing and moving in response to storms and other conditions. And finally, our friend the raccoon, they get a bad rap in my PowerPoint, but mammalian predators are really hard on birds. If you're a ground nesting bird especially, they just really like to eat eggs. So when you're at the beach, even if it's organic, even if you think your food trash is going to get naturally taken care of, pack it out anyway, because we don't want to subsidize that raccoon. They'll do just fine without our food and our scraps, and we will help to keep their populations manageable for the nesting birds. So you made it through the end of a Zoom meeting. I can't believe people are still coming to Zoom meetings. I'm glad you are. These are some least tern chicks. And this is just why we do what we do. It's why we work hard to protect these birds so that these little guys have a chance to grow up and become adults. And with that, I can take questions, and credit to the photographers.
Awesome, Lindsay, thank you so much for this presentation. I know I've learned something. I have a question or two, but I would like to invite other people to ask their questions first. So if anybody has a question, unmute and feel free to ask it.
I'd like to ask how she manages to catch those birds to band them.
That's a good question. So a lot of the birds we band when they're chicks and they can't fly yet. So hopefully the easiest way to catch them is if they're hiding in a little bit of vegetation, or sometimes they just hunker down in the middle of the sand and hope you don't see them because they are pretty camouflaged, and we just get to pick them up. Some of the other birds that we band, we have to be a little bit more crafty. Sometimes sometimes we use hand nets, or set up kind of a drift net, like just some gardening mesh, and you can kind of chase the chicks into the gardening mesh and kind of encircle them that way. And we do band adults sometimes, and we use subterfuge on the adults. When we're banding oyster catchers, we have a decoy and some playback of their territorial call, and we lure them onto what we call a loop carpet, which is kind of a wire base with some little loops tied in it. So when they step on the trap, their legs, hopefully if it works, the legs get caught in the loops, and the loops tighten on their legs, and they can't fly away. So mostly we pick them up, but sometimes we're sneaky.
Interesting, thank you.
So I have a quick question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a background in GIS. Does Audubon, North Carolina ever need volunteers to do any kind of GIS analysis?
That's a good question. We do sometimes we do use GIS, and I should have put my email up here, but it's possible that it would be useful. It is L Addison at Audubon.org. So basically, if you see my name on the photo credits, it's my first initial, my last name, at Audubon.org. So maybe we will.
Great,
I have added that to the chat. So if anyone wants to get in touch, you can copy that from the chat.
Oh, thanks, Stephanie.
Sure, no problem. I was curious about, you said if we saw a bird and we were able to see the band on it, or capture a photo of it, is there a place to report that? Like to go and say you saw this individual bird? Yes.
So the interwebs being what they are, you can a Google search will solve most of those questions. But the oyster catchers, I'm proud to say we have an actual website for all the oyster catcher bands that have been put out, and I actually am the administrator of the oyster catcher band database. So if you see a banded oyster catcher, you can go to amoywg.org. That's American Oyster Catcher Working Group. That's our website. And there is a band sighting page where you can report your banded oyster catchers to, and you'll get an email back, and you'll get to see a map that shows where all the other places that your bird has been seen. For most other banded birds, if you kind of Google banded bird, you'll end up at the Bird Banding Lab's website. The Bird Banding Lab is part of the USGS, and in order to band birds in the United States, you have to have a permit. They administer that program. They issue the metal bands. They keep track of all the records, and that's where you can report most other species. And in fact, you can report oyster catchers there as well, but will come to us eventually anyway. So that is so that's you just type in, it's reportban.gov is their website.
Okay.
They've got the Google search thing locked down. Like it's not, you don't have to go to the next page, you know, it's right there at the top. But yeah, and when if you do see a banded bird, just make a mental note, or jot it down where you were when you saw the bird, and the date, because those are the band, the date, and the location are the 3 pieces of information that will make your sighting meaningful.
Lindsay, there is one question in the chat. It comes from Jane. It says, in non-pandemic times, do you do guided walks for the general public? Not necessarily of nesting sites.
Yeah. So in a normal year, I would be pitching the fact that we have a weekly bird walk at the south end of Wrightsville Beach from May through August, which actually takes you to see the nesting colony there, the least terns, the black skimmers, and that's Monday mornings at 9 o'clock in a non-pandemic year. We have not been able to do those this year. They're outdoors, but sometimes we get large groups of people, and we just don't know how everyone's going to behave. So we didn't want to put our staff or anyone who would come out for the walk at risk. So we don't have them this year, but we do normally have them. Another great resource for bird walks is the Cape Fear Audubon Society. That's our local chapter here in the Wilmington area. And if you're not in Wilmington, you might be near another local Audubon chapter. They often most chapters do at least monthly bird walks. So that's a year-round pursuit, and it won't just be limited to coastal birds. They might go to all kinds of other sites. And then I believe locally in Wilmington, Wild Bird and Garden is able to do its free Wednesday early garden bird walks. And so if you're in the Wilmington area and want to go bird watching with a group, we're not offering anything right now, but Wild Bird and Garden, Wednesday mornings at Early Gardens is doing that. I think you need to, there's social distancing and all that good stuff. So I think it's a safe opportunity and a really great time of year. We're starting, migration is going to get underway, even though it feels like the middle of summer. Migration is starting for some species, and it will get underway as we roll into August. So it's a great time to try to come out.
Awesome. There's a lot of opportunity. Thank you for sharing yours and others. Do appreciate that. All right. So if there are no other questions for Lindsay, I would like to say thanks again for everyone who is still with us here at the end, and invite you all to come back next week for Lloyd Singleton from the New Hanover County Extension and Arboretum. We'll be talking about native plants and the Coastal Landscapes Initiative. Going to be really cool, especially if you're interested in knowing what to do with native plants in your yard. July 31st, our summer intern, Joel Cook, will be talking about Reeves Chapel and the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Joel is really a great guy. We only have him for a few weeks, so we're super glad that he's going to be able to join us and talk about his work in community conservation in Brunswick County. And then August 7th is also another very special little lunch lecture. We will be doing a dedication of our Salters Creek Preserve. This was 5,400 acres that we saved last summer in Carteret County, and because of circumstances and now COVID circumstances, we're not going to be able to do an on-site dedication. So we wanted to bring it to the public as a little lunch lecture, and we'll be able to tell the story of Salters Creek and all the amazing partners that helped make that huge conservation area a success. So please join us August 7th, regular time and place on Zoom. for the dedication of our Salters Creek Preserve. So I think that is about all the announcements I have for today, but I do hope to see you next week and hope you have a great weekend. Thanks. Bye, everybody.